Nhpum Ga Hill, Burma, the night of April 6, 1944. A man crawled out of the American line and into the dark. No rifle, just grenades tucked against his body. He moved on his elbows through the mud, forward, toward the sound of the Japanese camp maybe 200 yards out. He could smell their cook fires. He could hear them, low voices, men settling in before an attack. He stopped. He listened, and he understood every word. The strange part isn't that he understood them. The strange part is that he was never supposed to be there at all. 2 years before that night in Burma, the United States government put this man behind barbed wire. They called him an enemy alien. They took the years of work, the neighborhood, the ordinary life he had built, and they locked him up. Because of his face. His parents were in Hiroshima. 3 of his brothers were in uniform on the other side of this war. One of them had been fighting for Japan on Guadalcanal, the same island where American boys from your town, from your father's unit, were dying in the mud and the jungle heat. And this man, the one the government called a threat, the one they put in a horse stall in California while they figured out what to do with him, was lying in the dark in Burma, listening to Japan plan its next attack, so that American soldiers could live through the night. His name was Roy Matsumoto, Staff Sergeant, Merrill's Marauders, and before that night was over, he was going to do something that no one in the history of the American military had ever done. He was going to stand up in his foxhole and shout an order, in Japanese, directly at the soldiers coming to kill his friends, not to surrender, to send them running into the guns that were waiting. This is that story, and it is also the story of what this country owes a man it once decided to cage. If something about that already feels important to you, hit the like button right now. Not for this channel. For men like Roy, the ones whose names never made it into the history books, but who decided, in the dark, who got to go home. To understand what Roy Matsumoto did on that hill in Burma, you have to go back to a farm outside Los Angeles, and a name that America couldn't pronounce. Roy's grandfather arrived in California in 1888. He came from Hiroshima Prefecture, and he came the way most Japanese immigrants came in those years, with very little, looking for land he could work and a place he could stay. He found a patch of ground in Laguna Beach, and he farmed it. His son Wakiji followed in 1908. 2 years later, a woman named Tai Kimura arrived by ship from Japan. She had never met Wakiji in person. She had seen a photograph. That was the arrangement. A picture bride, as the community called it. You chose from a photograph, and you trusted that what you saw was what you were getting. T and Wakiji settled into the life the family had been building. And in 1913, their son was born. They named him Hiroshi. His first week of school, his teacher looked at the name on the enrollment card and told him it was too hard to say. She would call him Roy instead. He went home that afternoon as Roy Matsumoto. America had its requirements. For the first 8 years of Roy's life, his world was that Southern California farm, the soil, the neighbors, the rhythm of a small agricultural community where most people worked hard and nobody had much. Then, in 1921, the family made a decision. They were going to visit relatives in Hiroshima, just for the summer. The summer stretched. The Depression was coming. It was already in the air. The squeeze on wages, the hostility toward Japanese workers that had been building since the 1906 San Francisco earthquake, and never really stopped. The family looked at what was waiting for them back in California, and they looked at what they had in Japan, and they decided to stay. Roy was 8 years old. He didn't choose any of it. He went to Japanese middle school, Chugako. He learned calligraphy, mathematics, the kind of literature that was considered appropriate for a Japanese boy his age. He did the mandatory military drills that were part of the curriculum. He learned how to stand in formation, how to respond to a command, the posture and the cadence that the imperial education system built into every boy, whether they asked for it or not. He was a California kid doing military training in Hiroshima. He got through it the way you get through things you don't particularly want to do, by keeping his head down and waiting it out. As the years passed, the rest of the family settled in Hiroshima for good. His brothers and sisters came. His parents settled in. Roy, 17 years old, got on a boat back to Long Beach, alone. He didn't explain that decision in any interview. He just did it. He crossed the Pacific by himself, enrolled at Long Beach Polytechnic High School, graduated in 1933, and stayed put while the rest of his family remained in Hiroshima. He left Japan when he did, and the timing mattered more than anyone knew at the time. If he had stayed even a year longer, he almost certainly would have been drafted into the Imperial Japanese Army. When the war came, Roy Matsumoto got to choose his uniform. Not every man in his family would. After high school, he worked. Odd jobs at first. The kind of work available to a young Japanese-American man in Southern California during the Depression. Which is to say, not much and not well paid. He found his way into delivery work, running groceries for a market that served the Japanese community in the Los Angeles area. It was the kind of job where you see a lot of people, and you don't make much money, but you learn things without realizing you're learning them. The customers at that market came from all over Japan: Hiroshima, Osaka, Okinawa, Kagoshima. Every prefecture had its own way of speaking. Not just different words, but different rhythms, different sounds at the ends of sentences, different ways of clipping certain syllables or drawing others long. Standard Japanese was one thing. What those customers spoke in casual conversation was something else entirely. And it was different from customer to customer and neighborhood to neighborhood. Roy chatted with them. He made small talk while he handed over the groceries. He wasn't studying. He was just being polite, being friendly, doing his job the way you do it when you want people to be glad to see you come to the door. He had no idea what he was doing to his ear. Now, before we go further, this is the part of the story that most people never heard, because Roy Matsumoto's file at the Military Intelligence Service was classified for 50 years. He came home from the war, and he didn't talk about it. Not because he was ashamed, because he was under orders not to. Which means that everything in this story, the crawling in the dark, the listening at enemy lines, the moment that saved an entire battalion, all of it sat in a folder in a government building for half a century, while the man who did it grew old and went fishing and collected eyeglasses for the Lions Club. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. By 1941, Roy Matsumoto was 28 years old. He had his job. He had his neighborhood. He had built exactly the kind of ordinary American life that doesn't make anyone's front page. Steady work, a small apartment, a city he knew well enough to navigate without thinking. And he had a family scattered across 2 countries that were about to go to war with each other. Here is what that family looked like on the morning of December 8th, 1941. The morning after Pearl Harbor. Roy's brother, Tsutomu, who went by Tom, was in the United States. He would, like Roy, eventually serve in the American Military Intelligence Service and retire as a colonel. His brother Noboru was in Japan. Noboru had been conscripted into the Imperial Army. He was in the artillery. He had been stationed at Guadalcanal. His brother Izo was in Japan. Imperial Army. His brother Hiroshi was in Japan. Imperial Army, assigned to China. Their parents, Wakaji and T, were in Hiroshima. Their sisters were with them. The family that had arrived in California in 1888 with nothing and built something. One farm, one household, one life at a time across 3 generations, had been split open by a war none of them started. Parents and sisters in a city that had not yet learned what an atomic bomb was. Roy was in Long Beach. He turned on the radio and listened to the news. The news came over the radio on the evening of December 7th, 1941. By the next morning, the FBI was moving through Japanese neighborhoods in Long Beach. They didn't need warrants. They didn't need evidence. They needed faces. Community leaders went first. The Buddhist priests, the men who ran the Japanese language schools, the businessmen who had spent 20 years building something in Southern California. Gone within days. Their families got no explanation. Just an absence where a person used to be. Roy watched this from his apartment. He was 28 years old. He had a job and a life and a city he knew. He had nothing to hide, and no way to prove that. 2 months later, on February 19th, 1942, President Roosevelt signed Executive Order 9066. It authorized the military to remove people of Japanese descent from designated zones along the West Coast. 120,000 people. 2/3 of them were American citizens, born on American soil, who had never set foot in Japan and had no intention of going. The order did not distinguish between citizens and non-citizens. It did not require proof of disloyalty. It required a face. Roy's face qualified. They sent him first to Santa Anita. Not the Santa Anita you might be thinking of. Not the grandstands and the infield and the carefully maintained track. The racetrack had been converted into an assembly center while the government figured out where to put everyone. More than 18,000 people moved through that facility in the months after Pearl Harbor. Roy's assigned quarters were in the stabling area. He slept in a horse stall. The floor had been swept, but not thoroughly. There were still traces in the wood, hay pressed flat. The smell that doesn't leave a place just because you've stopped using it for its original purpose. He made his bed, and he stayed. From Santa Anita, the Army moved him to Jerome Relocation Center, Chicot County, Arkansas. Swampland converted into barracks, barbed wire strung around the perimeter, guard towers at the corners. The Arkansas Delta in summer is a different kind of heat than California. Humid in a way that settles into your clothes and stays there. Roy found work in the mess kitchen. He organized food stores, managed supply logistics, figured out how to feed hundreds of people 3 times a day out of what the government allocated. He was good at it. He found the inefficiencies and fixed them without being asked. Inside Jerome, people were working through the same set of questions that every Japanese-American family in every camp across the country was wrestling with. The government eventually distributed a loyalty questionnaire, 2 questions that would determine whether you were cooperating or not. Men who answered no to both became known as no-nos. Some lost their citizenship. Some were separated from their families and sent to a different camp entirely. The arguments about those questions ran through every barrack in Jerome. Roy didn't argue. He listened. He watched. He made his observations and kept them to himself. That was already a habit. It would matter later. In 1942, recruiters from the Military Intelligence Service came to Jerome. The Army needed Japanese speakers, not for stateside work, for the Pacific. They needed men who could read captured documents, translate intercepted radio traffic, sit across from a Japanese prisoner and conduct a real interrogation in the prisoner's own language. They were running out of options. Most Americans who spoke Japanese had just been locked up. So they came to the camps and they asked for volunteers. About 200 Nisei at Jerome put their names forward. Many others refused, and not without reason. A man could be forgiven for looking at the situation clearly. The country had stripped him of his home, put him behind wire, and was now asking him to go fight for it. That argument was available to anyone who wanted to make it. Roy did not make it. He signed his name. He never explained why, not in any way that made it into the record. In an interview decades later, when a researcher asked him about the decision, he gave a short answer and moved on. What he said was that he was American. 3 words, no elaboration. Whatever was behind them. He kept it. They sent him to Camp Savage, Minnesota, the Military Intelligence Service language school, up near Minneapolis, where Nisei linguists were being trained in the specific skills the Army needed, not just conversational Japanese, but the ability to read military documents, interpret technical language, work with dialects that didn't follow standard patterns. Roy finished at the top of his class. His instructors noted something specific about his performance. He had an unusual facility with regional dialects, rural speech patterns, the way people from the Japanese countryside talked when they weren't trying to sound educated. It wasn't something that could be drilled into someone. You either had it, or you didn't. The other students in the program were smart, dedicated, some of them more formally educated in Japanese than Roy had ever been. But when it came to hearing exactly what someone said and understanding exactly what they meant, including the vocabulary of farmers and fishermen and small-town boys who had never been to Tokyo, Roy was in a category by himself. Nobody at Camp Savage knew why. Roy knew. It was the grocery delivery route, the customers, the men who drove out to Los Angeles from their farms and their fishing villages and stood at that counter and talked, in the particular way of people who are comfortable and not performing, in every regional accent Japan produced. He hadn't been studying. He'd been doing his job. After Camp Savage, Camp Shelby, Mississippi, basic infantry training. The Army wanted its linguists to be able to function in combat, not just in a tent behind the lines. And then, a list. 14 names. An assignment to a unit that hadn't been named yet. The orders said the mission would be hazardous. They said it would be of long duration. They did not say where or what the chances were of coming back. Roy was on the list. He packed what they told him to pack and got on the transport. In August of 1943, at a conference in Quebec, the Allied leadership made a decision about northern Burma. The logic was straightforward. Japan had cut the Burma Road, the overland supply route that had been keeping China in the war. Without that road, everything going to China had to fly over the Himalayas, a route so dangerous that American pilots called it the hump. More than 1,000 men died flying it. The planes that made it through delivered a fraction of what the road had carried. To reopen northern Burma, you needed to take Myitkyina. It was the only all-weather airfield in the region, the one piece of infrastructure that could change the strategic picture in the entire China-Burma-India theater. The Allied generals decided to create an American long-range penetration unit. Something built after the model the British had been experimenting with. Small, fast, lightly supplied, capable of moving through jungle terrain that conventional forces couldn't touch, appearing deep behind Japanese lines before the Japanese knew anyone was coming. They put out a call for volunteers. The description was brief. Hazardous mission. Long duration. No further details. Men from Pacific combat units answered it. Men who had already survived Guadalcanal, the Solomons, the Caribbean campaigns. They volunteered for a second assignment without knowing what the first one had cost them the right to refuse. Nearly 3,000 of them. The unit was officially designated the 5,307th Composite Unit. Provisional. Its code name was Galahad, a Time magazine correspondent, trying to find something that would catch in print, named them after their commander, Brigadier General Frank Merrill, Merrill's Marauders. The name stuck. The men used it themselves. 6 combat teams, each identified by color: blue, green, khaki, orange, red, white. 14 Nisei linguists distributed across the teams. Roy Matsumoto went to the Green Combat Team, 2nd Battalion. In October 1943, the unit assembled in Deoghar, India, for jungle training. In February 1944, they started walking. Northern Burma is not the jungle of the movies. It is not open and dramatic. It does not have clearings and dramatic light breaking through the canopy. It has bamboo so dense that a man can stand 2 feet from another man and not see him. It has river crossings where the current moves fast and the bottom is uncertain, and rifles have to be held overhead to keep the actions dry. It has leeches that find their way through any clothing and attach without any sensation at all. It has mosquitoes that carry malaria. And the malaria in that region wasn't the kind you recovered from quickly. It came back. The humidity ran near 95% for most of the day. Daytime temperatures reached into the hundreds. At night, in the highlands, it dropped far enough that men who had sweated through their uniforms woke up cold. Everything rotted. Wounds that should have been minor became serious in days. Boots disintegrated on the trail. Uniforms went first at the seams. Scrub typhus lived in the grass and soil of certain areas. A mite-borne fever that could kill a healthy man in 2 weeks if he didn't get treatment. And treatment was not always available when he needed it. Men who slept on the ground without protection were gambling on which patch of earth was infected and which wasn't. Each marauder carried between 40 and 60 pounds on his back. There were no roads and no vehicles. Mules carried the 60mm mortars and the heavy ammunition. Men carried everything else. And they ate 1 K ration a day. A K ration was designed to be 3 meals compressed into a small package. The calorie count was 2,830, adequate for a soldier doing moderate activity in a temperate climate. It was not adequate for a man moving through jungle terrain, climbing, carrying heavy loads, sweating constantly, fighting off infections. Lieutenant General Stilwell's staff in Lado had decided it was sufficient. They made that decision from an office. The Marauders ate it and kept walking. Roy's job on paper was translator and intelligence specialist. He interrogated prisoners when there were any to interrogate. He translated captured documents, orders, maps, letters from soldiers to their families that sometimes contained information about unit positions and morale. He worked on intercepted radio transmissions. He did all of that. It was real work, and it mattered. But he had also noticed something in those first weeks on the trail. Sound moves differently in dense jungle at night. The vegetation absorbs it in some directions and channels it in others. A conversation happening 200 yards away might be completely inaudible from one angle and perfectly clear from another. The jungle creates its own acoustics, and those acoustics reward a man who knows how to be still. Roy started paying attention to what he could hear at night when the column stopped. Japanese soldiers in the field talked. They talked the way all soldiers talk, about food, about home, about what was going to happen tomorrow and whether they were worried about it. They talked in the voices people use when they are tired and they think they are among friends, and nobody outside their circle can understand them. The other linguists on the team could follow standard Japanese well enough. But these were not men who had attended Japanese schools in cities. These were conscripts from prefectures that had their own rhythms, their own vocabulary, their own way of cutting certain sounds short and drawing others long. Roy had spent years listening to that, without knowing he was doing it, without any plan to make it useful. He lay still in the dark, and he understood things. The first engagement came in early March, at a place called Nhpum. The Hukong Valley was the main Japanese supply corridor in northern Burma, the artery that kept their northern forces fed and armed and able to resist. The plan was straightforward in the way that plans sound straightforward when you describe them from a distance. Chinese forces under Stilwell would push south through the valley, while the Marauders swung wide around the Japanese flank and set up roadblocks to cut off the retreat. The Marauders did their part. They moved through terrain that Japanese commanders had considered impassable, set up their positions, and held. Roy was on a reconnaissance patrol along a jungle trail when someone in the team stopped and pointed. A telephone wire. Japanese. Running along the ground beside the path, half buried in leaves, heading toward the rear of the enemy position. They didn't cut it. They tapped it. Roy put the receiver to his ear. A Japanese corporal was filing a routine supply report to his commanding officer. Location of an ammunition depot. Current inventory. Security arrangements. The man spoke in Hiroshima dialect, the same rhythms Roy had heard for years at a counter in Los Angeles, from men who drove in on Saturday mornings and wanted to talk while they waited. He wrote down every word. The information went up the chain. American aircraft found the depot and destroyed it. The Japanese supply line through Wallabum collapsed. The Chinese force that had been stalled for weeks began to move. General Merrill awarded Roy the Legion of Merit. He presented it personally. When Roy's commanding officer was later asked by a superior why he hadn't put Matsumoto up for something higher, the Distinguished Service Cross, maybe the Medal of Honor, the officer's answer was recorded in writing. He said, he was only an enlisted man doing his duty. That sentence exists in the historical record. Make of it what you will. They kept moving south. Shadows up, in Kangatong. 2 more roadblock operations in quick succession, each one requiring the same sequence. Days of marching through jungle to get into position. A fight to hold that position. A withdrawal. Then more marching. The distances on a map looked manageable. On the ground, through that terrain, carrying that weight, on that ration. They were not. By late March, after 6 weeks of continuous operations, the unit was fraying at the edges. Malaria was no longer something that happened to other men. It was moving through the ranks methodically, cycling through fevers and chills, and a kind of exhaustion that didn't go away with sleep because there wasn't enough sleep, and the body was fighting too many things at once. The ones who weren't sick were carrying extra loads to cover for the ones who were. General Merrill told the battalion commanders what he'd been authorized to tell them. 1 more mission, and then rest. Replacements. Time to rebuild. The mission was to move south and secure a position at a place called Nhpum Ga. Hold an intersection. Keep the Japanese from using it. Then pull back. The 2nd Battalion, Roy's battalion, drew the assignment. Nhpum Ga was a narrow ridge rising above the surrounding terrain, covered in jungle, with a trail running along its spine. In dry weather, on a map, it looked like a straightforward defensive position. High ground, clear fields of fire on the slopes. On March 28th, 2nd Battalion moved into position. The Japanese moved with them. By the time the Americans had their perimeter set, Japanese forces had encircled the base of the ridge. The encirclement closed the trail in both directions. No supplies in, no casualties out. No way down the slope without entering a killing ground that the Japanese had pre-registered with their weapons. The next morning, no resupply drop made it through. The drop zones were too exposed. The morning after that, the water source ran out. The only water on Nhpum Ga was at the bottom of the hill. Japanese machine guns covered every route to it. Men began rationing what they had in their canteens, then rationing the rationing, in that heat, in that humidity, doing the physical work of maintaining a perimeter and rotating watch and carrying wounded men and digging improved positions. The body's need for water is not theoretical. Men began going down from dehydration while they still had ammunition. The mules that had carried supplies and weapons into the position were dying. There wasn't room to bury them. The ridge was narrow, the perimeter tight, and the days were hot. By the end of the first week, the soldiers who were not on watch were sharing the ground with animals they couldn't move. The men called it Maggot Hill. The 3rd Battalion was fighting its way south to break the siege. It was moving as fast as it could through the same terrain that had slowed everyone down. Every day they radioed their progress. Every day, 2nd Battalion radioed back. Lieutenant Colonel McGee's radio message, as it was later recorded, was 4 words: "Please hurry." On the 4th day of the siege, Roy Matsumoto went to find McGee. He had a proposal. Every night, Roy had noticed, the Japanese positions were louder than they were during the day. Men off watch talked, fires crackled. The jungle's acoustics carried sound in ways that daylight movement masked. He had been lying in his position at the perimeter and hearing fragments, not enough to do anything with, but enough to know that more was available if he could get closer. He told McGee he wanted to go out past the wire after dark, crawl forward to the edge of the Japanese perimeter, lie still and listen. McGee asked what he'd carry. "Grenades," Roy said, "not a rifle." The sound of a rifle bolt in the dark carries farther than you'd expect. McGee asked what happened if he was spotted. Roy had thought about that. He didn't answer it in a way that was reassuring. McGee said yes. That night, Roy Matsumoto crawled out of the American perimeter and into the dark between the lines. He moved on his belly, stopping every few yards to listen, checking his direction by sound. He found a position in the undergrowth, close enough to the Japanese line to hear voices clearly, close enough that he could make out individual words, individual speakers, the shift from one man's voice to another. He lay there for a long time. Then he crawled back. From that night forward, he went out every night, not because anyone ordered him to, because no one else could do what he was doing. And what he was doing was the only thing on that hill that was working. The men in those Japanese positions were conscripts from rural Japan, talking in the casual voices of men who believe the night is their own. They spoke the dialects of farmers and fishermen, not the clipped standard Japanese of military education, but the particular speech of people from specific places, people who had grown up hearing certain words said certain ways and had never thought about it. He had spent years learning to hear exactly that. The night of April 5th, Roy came back from his crawl with something specific. He told McGee the Japanese were planning an attack before dawn. The direction would be from the east side of the perimeter. They intended to hit the section of the line that had shown the most weakness under the strain of the siege. McGee moved his reserve quietly. No lanterns, no raised voices, men repositioning in darkness, finding their new spots, settling in. At 4:30 in the morning of April 6th, the attacks came from exactly the direction Roy had described. The Americans were waiting. The assault broke. The Japanese pulled back. No Marauders died in that engagement. McGee found Roy when it was light. He asked, "Can you go out again tonight?" Roy said yes. April 6th was a long day. The perimeter held, but the siege didn't lift. Supplies were still not getting through in adequate quantities. The sick were still lying in whatever shade the men had constructed for them. The mules were still where they had fallen. By midday, the Japanese side of the perimeter had gone quiet, not the ordinary quiet of men resting between their activities, something more deliberate. The sounds that had been background noise for days, voices, movement, the occasional metallic clank of equipment, had stopped. The men on watch didn't relax when it got quiet. They tightened. Silence in a jungle means someone has made a decision. At 10 o'clock that night, Roy went out again. He moved more carefully than usual. The silence during the day had told him something was different, and different meant he needed to be closer to hear it clearly. He pushed a little further past the point where he'd stopped the night before. He found what the silence had meant. The Japanese had revised their plan. The previous night's attack had failed because the Americans had been waiting. The force's commander had worked out an answer to that problem. The new plan had 2 waves. The first wave would attack directly into the American line, not to break through, but to draw fire, force the defenders to empty their magazines, expose their positions, commit to that axis, then pull back. Let the Americans reload and reorient. In that moment of reloading, the second wave would hit from the flank. Roy lay in the undergrowth and listened until he had heard it twice, from 2 different voices. Then he crawled back. It was after 2 in the morning when Roy finished his report. McGee gathered his officers in the dark. No lights. Men leaning in to hear. Voices low enough not to carry. The decision was made in minutes. They would not simply defend. They would use the plan against the people who had made it. The forward edge of the perimeter pulled back 20 feet. The ground it had just abandoned was prepared. Grenade trip wires in the undergrowth. Booby traps along the natural approach routes. The jungle's own terrain arranged to do work the Americans wouldn't have to do by hand. The pullback opened a field of fire that hadn't existed before. A clean lane from the new line to the tree line, where the first wave would come through. When the first wave came, McGee's men would let them into the prepared ground. Fire after the traps fired. Break the wave hard. In the confusion that followed, when the second wave was listening for its signal and couldn't find it through the noise, Roy Matsumoto would give them one. Nobody slept between 2 and 4:30. Men checked their weapons in the dark the way you check things you have already checked, because checking is something to do with your hands while you wait. Some of them knew roughly what was planned. Some of them only knew to be ready and to hold. Roy sat with his back against a tree and thought about whatever a man thinks about in the hour before. Before first light on April 7th, 1944, the first wave came. They moved through the trees in the dark, and they hit the ground the Americans had just vacated, and the ground answered. Tripwires. Grenades. The line opened fire from its new position, 20 feet back, with the whole prepared zone in front of it. The first wave broke in minutes. The second wave heard it and stopped. In dense jungle, at night, under fire from a direction you didn't expect. The chain of command is only as good as your ability to hear it. The Japanese officer who was supposed to order the second wave forward was somewhere behind the tree line, and his voice was not reaching his men through the noise and the trees and the chaos of what had just happened to the men in front of them. A few seconds passed. The second wave was standing still, in the dark, waiting for an order. Roy Matsumoto stood up in his foxhole. He pulled air into his lungs and he shouted in Japanese, not a translation, not a word-for-word rendering, but the sound of a Japanese officer's voice giving a command, the cadence and the register and the particular authority that those rural conscripts had been responding to since they were called up. The voice of someone above them in a structure they had been trained not to question. Totsugeki. Totsugeki. Charge. Charge. The second wave obeyed. They came through the tree line at a run, in the direction the order had sent them, into the lane that McGee's men had spent the last 2 hours clearing and preparing and waiting behind. The Marauders were already firing before the Japanese reached the halfway point. When the sun came up on April 7th, they counted what the night had left. 54 Japanese soldiers dead. 2 of them officers. Not one Marauder killed in the ambush. The men who had held that hill for 13 days looked at each other in the morning light and didn't say much. There wasn't a lot to say. They were still sick, still exhausted, still on a ridge surrounded by jungle with their dead animals and their wounded men. But the thing that had been coming for them in the dark had come, and it hadn't gotten what it came for. 2 days later, on Easter Sunday, April 9th, the 3rd Battalion broke through from the south. The siege of Nhpum Ga was over. McGee wrote up what Matsumoto had done and sent it up the chain. Whatever came of it in the paperwork, Roy Matsumoto never received a decoration commensurate with what he had done on that hill. He never explained it. He just did it. And for the men on that hill, that was the only explanation that mattered. Merrill had made a promise. After Nhpum Ga, the unit would rest. Replacements would come. Time to recover. Time to rebuild. Time to let the sick men heal. The promise lasted about 2 weeks. Stilwell's staff had identified a window. Myitkyina, the airfield that had been the objective from the beginning, might be vulnerable if you moved fast enough. Before the monsoon closed in. Before the Japanese reinforced it. The Marauders were the only American force close enough and light enough to make the approach. Merrill told the battalion commanders what he'd been told to tell them. They were going again. Some men in the formation that assembled for the next mission could not stand up straight. Scrub typhus does things to the body over weeks that medicine can partially address, but doesn't reverse. Not quickly. Not in the field. They stood up anyway. Some of them were carried part of the way. On April 28th, the Myitkyina Task Force moved out. The Marauders, 2 Chinese infantry regiments, close to 6,000 men total. They turned toward the Kumon mountain range. The Kumon range rises to over 6,000 feet. The trails through it, such as they were, gained 20% grade in places. Staff Sergeant James McGuire wrote in his diary on the first day of the approach, "Raining. 6:30 a.m. Started hiking. Went up 2,600 feet. Really a tough climb. The path is a 20% incline." He wrote that as a fact, not a complaint. It rained most of the 17 days it took to cross. The column did not stop for weather. It did not stop for the sick. On the morning of May 17th, 1944, the reconnaissance elements of the Marauders reached the edge of the Myitkyina airfield before dawn. By 10 o'clock, the assault was on. The Japanese garrison at the airfield was not prepared for men to have come from that direction, through that terrain, in those conditions. The field fell in hours. An American plane landed on it that same afternoon. Winston Churchill called what the Marauders had accomplished a brilliant feat of arms. Stilwell did not release them. There was still the town of Myitkyina, adjacent to the airfield, held by a substantial Japanese force. The Marauders fought it for another 2.5 months. Malaria, scrub typhus, combat, until August 3rd, when the Japanese commander ended it the way Japanese commanders of that era often ended things when they had no options left. On August 10th, 1944, the 5,307th Composite Unit, provisional, was officially dissolved. 2,997 men had walked into Burma in February. 130 were still fit for duty when the unit closed its books. 93 had been killed in action. 30 had died of disease. 1,970 had been hospitalized. One battalion that had gone in at 564 men reported a final strength of 12. Roy was among those who made it through. He transferred to the 475th Infantry, then to work in China, war crimes tribunals, prisoner interrogations, the cleanup work of a war that was winding down region by region. In late 1945, Roy was working out of Shanghai. Part of his job was going through prisoner rosters, Japanese soldiers who had surrendered or been captured as the war ended, sorted by unit, waiting for processing. He was working through a list from the Japanese 5th Division when he stopped at a name, Yoro Omoto. He read it again. Omoto was his mother's family name. Yoro, Harry, in the family's American usage, his cousin. Roy went to the detention area and found him, a young man in a ragged Japanese uniform who had been fighting on the other side of the same war. His cousin had news. Roy's brother Hiroshi was also a prisoner, held nearby. He had served in the Japanese army in China. Roy found him. Two men, born in California to the same parents, raised in different countries by the accident of a family that had split in half when they were boys. One had spent the war crawling through Burmese jungle in an American uniform, listening to Japanese soldiers plan their attacks. The other had spent it fighting in China in a Japanese one. They stood in Shanghai in the fall of 1945 and looked at each other. There are no records of what was said. There may not have been much. Some reunions don't need words, or the words that come don't come right away, and later you can't remember what they were. His cousin also had word from Hiroshima. The family had survived. They had moved from the house they had been living in, relocated for reasons that had nothing to do with any warning, just the ordinary movement of a family's life, some months before August 6th. The new place was 2 blocks from the hypo center. 2 blocks. There is no way to explain that. Roy didn't try. He stayed in the army. He retired in 1963 as a master sergeant, after 20 years of service. He settled eventually on San Juan Island, in Washington State, far north, quiet. A place where the water was cold, and the summers were short, and a man could go fishing without anyone particularly caring who he was. He helped run the Lions Club. He collected eyeglasses for people on the island who needed them and couldn't afford them. His neighbors knew him as a quiet man who showed up when things needed doing and didn't make a production of it. His daughter Karen grew up knowing her father had served. She did not know, for most of her life, what he had actually done. His MIS records were classified for 50 years. The work those men had done, the nights outside the wire, the intelligence that had shifted the outcomes of engagements across the Pacific, had been sealed and filed and kept from the public and from the families of the men who had done it. Karen found out from the records after he was gone. In 1993, 49 years after the night on Nhpum Ga Ridge, Roy Matsumoto was inducted into the Ranger Hall of Fame at Fort Benning. In 1997, the Military Intelligence Corps Hall of Fame. In 2011, he received the Congressional Gold Medal, awarded collectively to the Nisei veterans of the Second World War. He was 98 years old when he accepted that medal. The veterans of 2nd Battalion, the men who had been in those foxholes on the morning of April 7th, 1944, said the same thing when anyone asked them about that night. We owe our lives to Matsumoto. Roy Matsumoto died on April 21st, 2014. He was 100 years old, 2 days after Easter, the same holiday that had marked the end of the siege, 70 years before. If your father served in the Second World War, or your grandfather, I want you to think about a dinner table, not a specific one. Any of them. The ones where someone asked a question about the war and got a short answer, or no answer, or a look that meant the question was going somewhere the man at the table wasn't going to follow it. Roy Matsumoto came home from Burma and didn't talk about what he had done, partly because he was ordered not to, partly because there are things that don't translate well from where they happen to a dinner table in peacetime. His daughter found the story in his records. That's how it works with a lot of them. The men who did the things that don't appear in the headlines, who made decisions at 3 a.m. that nobody ever recorded, who came home and went back to being ordinary people in ordinary towns and took what they'd carried with them to the end. In the comments below, leave a name. Where they served. If you remember one thing they said at the dinner table, even a small thing, even something that didn't make sense to you until much later, write it down. Don't let that go. Those stories belong to all of us. Once the people who carry them are gone, they're gone. Roy Matsumoto spent his last years on a quiet island in the Pacific Northwest, collecting eyeglasses for his neighbors, going fishing on the cold water. The men who were in those foxholes knew who he was. Now you do too.